AJ, thank you so much for joining today. I'm super excited to talk for a little bit about
Mm,
the recent work that you've been showing, the recent work that you've been working on. 2025 has been a big year so far for you, and you have some works now on view at the Pinot Collection, including Love is the Message, a Ghidra, and a Kingdom Cometh As. And Love is the Message is now almost 10 years old. And so I was wondering if there were things that have stood out to you or that you are being reminded of and seeing it now as it's kind of matured and been received in different ways. It's your first time showing it in Paris, so I'm wondering if introducing it to a new audience has revealed new things and what it's like to kind of have that sustained engagement.
mm. Um, it certainly was interested in, showing it in Paris. I mean, like you said, it's almost 10 years old. It's hard, would have been hard to anticipate the sort of reception to it. And, I've told the story a zillion times, but when I made Love is a Message, it wasn't anything I set out to make in the sense of I didn't have a battle plan. It wasn't like, I'm going to make this thing that's going to do X, Y, and Z. And And I certainly hadn't anticipated it in the art world. At the time, I wasn't really thinking about the art world at all. I mean, I've had a history, a trajectory of like studied architecture at Howard University. Somewhere along the line, decided, I don't think this is for me in terms of, actually practicing. Had become very interested, or maybe like formally interested in cinema. I was always interested in cinema. Um, I grew up in a small town in Clarksdale, that in Mississippi rather, Clarksdale, Mississippi, and which has sort of been in the news recently because of Ryan Coogler's film Sinners. Uh, Not only because it's featured in the film, but I know just in this past couple of weeks, they had signed a petition in Clarksdale to have the film screened in Clarksdale.
Oh, wonderful.
And there's no current movie theaters in Clarksdale. So
Mm,
it gives you a sense of how, the town itself has kind of gone down over the past 30, 40 years, I
mm,
would say. My brother would often say, like, it's Beirut. It's like Beirut. That became
mm,
this code word for,
mm,
the decline, the depopulation of Clarksdale in particular. It made me think about my movie experiences in Clarksdale. When I grew up, there were four theaters, if I remember correctly, in Clarksdale. There was the Paramount, which was downtown
mm,
on Main Street of Clarksdale. There was the Roxy
mm,
on Issaquena, which is literally across the tracks from downtown. That was the Black Theater.
mm,
That was where you would see black exploitation films,
mm,
martial arts, kung fu movies. This is all in the early 70s. Kung fu movies and the occasional soft porn and exploitation films. And then in the around 70 or so, a new theater opened. That was the Westgate Cinema. And that
mm,
was in deep in the white part of town, like deep in the white part of town. So early on, it was a thing to even go to that theater. Like not that it was segregated or anything, because it wasn't. I mean, this is post-segregation, and there was never any like separation of where you sat or anything like that. But it was decidedly in the white part of town, not the commonly shared part of town. So I was just thinking about my history of going to those theaters, the various things I had seen. I was talking to a producer friend of mine this week, and he said something about Fiddler on the Roof.
mm,
We were talking about like where you grew up. He grew up in New York. I grew up in the South.
mm,
And he said Fiddler on the Roof. And I was like, wow, I had one of my most primordial movie experiences watching Fiddler on the Roof of
mm,
all things. Nothing I would have ever chosen to go to on my own accord, but a class trip, took us to see
mm,
Fiddler on the Roof. But I was like, well, what films would those be? I mean, what were my
mm,
primordial experiences?
mm.
Number one, because I've talked about it so much, so obviously 2001, The Space
Yeah,
Odyssey, which I saw at the Westgate,
yeah.
that theater that was in the white part of town. But the other things that come to mind are it's like five films really at the end of the day. And it's
Mm,
funny how collectively they shape a large part of my ambitions as a filmmaker, certainly, but even maybe like artistically. So one would be Fiddler on the Roof. These are not necessarily things that I think are the greatest films for
yeah,
sure. But Fiddler on the Roof, just because it's so culturally specific, I mean,
yeah.
it might be the first thing I ever saw that mapped out Jewishness or something
Hmm.
like that. I didn't, you know, I didn't completely understand that Jewish people weren't just white people
Mm,
until I think I was in college, honestly.
yeah.
They were just white folks as far as I could tell. So Fiddler on the Roof, The Poseidon Adventure, which was traumatic to this day. I don't want to, I don't fuck with
Mm,
water too deep.
mm, mm,
um, Omega Man,
mm,
Charlton Heston, post-apocalyptic,
mm,
last man in the world. Uh, and and Willy Wonka,
mm.
you know?
Yeah, it's so I think on that note, there are two things that I'm interested in. In thinking about your work, you were the first to introduce me to Samuel R. Delaney.
Oh, okay.
And I think that there's sort of this interest in your work that I think it makes him an interesting interlocutor in, I think particularly in works like 2001 that have sort of this very formal kind of genre defining sci-fi quality. And then someone like Delaney's work, which is kind of has such a black ethos to it as well. I'm kind of curious how this interest in the storytelling that you are interested in, why kind of these science fiction staples became
Hmm.
of interest to a way of mediating or thinking through blackness in a particular way.
Um, Obviously, I would have never framed it like that necessarily.
Mm,
Certainly not when I was a kid. But and it's funny, like when you say Samuel Delaney, the blackness of his work. I mean, he certainly is a black author,
mm,
very black, very much a black man, obviously, amongst other things. But one of the things that there was always a certain degree of tension to me in Delaney's work was precisely how his blackness was inscribed in his actual fiction.
mm,
I mean, to a certain degree, up until a point, it just seemed like there weren't even really unambiguously black characters in his books. I
yeah,
mean, you'd be hard placed to find one. Now, of course, there's certainly Lord Von Ray in Nova. That's kind of like the first time you had a character who presented, to me at least,
yeah,
presented to me as black. But even then, he was biracial,
hmm,
which is kind of interesting. It's like this thing with Delaney. I would also say you could see a very similar thing with Prince.
hmm,
There's a kind of trope around biraciality,
hmm,
even though in fact Prince is not biracial.
hmm,
Both his parents are unambiguously black.
yeah,
Same thing with Samuel Delaney. He comes from a very, well-known, well-regarded family in Harlem, funeral home owners. Mom is black, dad is black. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah,
very interesting, this whole thing of like, one might presume to a certain degree that Delaney would be biracial, even though he
mm,
never claimed as such. But if you read his fiction, you would get that impression,
mm,
through the earlier books, through Nova, through Titan, through certainly through Dahlgren, which in many ways was the book that I most complicatedly had to
mm,
contend with as a teenager. I mean, I read Nova, I think, after I read Dahlgren, you know what I
mm,
mean? Dahlgren was the one. And then I don't think, in a way, in the science fiction, properly speaking, you don't get to what I would consider unambiguously, even though complexly so, black character until you get to Stars in My Pocket,
mm,
like grains of sand, which somewhat tellingly, I felt like, and this sort of seemed to align in some ways with this sense that one had that there was some sort of problematic around blackness in Delaney's work.
mm,
But that, those two characters, particularly Rat Korga, and Mark Death, who of course were like literally star-crossed lovers
Mm,
in the book, were both black. Famously, one of the early, if not the first line in Stars in My Pocket, like grains of sand, is something like, "Of course you will be a slave."
mm,
Uh, and Delaney had said, I've read him, in one of his interviews, that the question for him was not whether they were black. They seemed explicitly so, but how they were black. You know what I mean?
mm,
The complexity of their blackness, and particularly with Mark Death, who comes from a trans special family, a family that
mm.
has more than one kind of species. It just doesn't just have humans. And he talks about his cousins not having hands but having claws.
Yeah.
It's an incredible book, but it's also a book that he could never finish, or
Mm,
rather, he never finished. So he
mm,
couldn't finish. And I couldn't understand for years and years because it's such an amazing book. And if you align that book along with this excerpt narrative that had originally been published in Triquarterly Review, it's the first thing I saw of Stars in
mm,
My Pocket. And it was a short story that he wrote that sort of bridged some of the narrative uh, components of what was supposed to be a diptych of books. The first
mm,
one was Stars in My Pocket, like grains of sand. And the second part of the book was going to be called The Splendid Misery of Cities, comma, of
mm,
Bodies.
mm,
Truly one of the greatest titles of all
mm,
time. But he could never finish it. And it
mm,
seemed, at least on the surface, it seemed somehow bound up with this whole question of black characters
mm,
and his capacity, willingness, or decision to be identified with them and
mm,
ambivalently identify with these black characters. It's interesting to me that you say blackness as it figures in Samuel's work. Very complicated and very different from, say, Octavia Butler, who would also
mm.
be the
Yeah.
next great Black author figure in the genre, science fiction. And I used to say, and this is a conversation that I and my friend Greg Tate had for over
Mm,
30, 40 years, because we both met having contended with Delaney.
mhm,
He might have been the first person I ever met who, I'm sure I met some people who had read Delaney, but I didn't know anybody personally who
yeah.
had contended with Delaney. And Delaney had figured we both had our stories of trying to read Dogman. And
Mm,
he told me like he remembers sitting in his parents' living room on a couch for like
mm,
3 or 4 days, just straight through reading Dogman. Me, on the other hand, took several years to read Dogman. I would start and just couldn't get through it. I was put it away, come back to it over a course of several years, and at some point, around 17 or 18, right, maybe right as I was a little bit before I was about to head off to Howard University, I cracked it like one summer,
mm,
and I just got through it. But Delaney, not in opposition or anything like that, but as opposed to Octavia Butler, who I feel like I used to say this. I don't know if I completely agree with this now anymore, but I just say science fiction. Sammy Daly was the first great author who was black, but Octavia Butler was the first great black science fiction author.
mm,
And what I was trying to get at by framing it like that is, Delaney was clearly black, no ambiguity about that. But the way blackness figured in his books versus Octavia Butler's
right.
books, which are really kind of very much constructed or built up around some semblance, at least, of black existential tropes, you know
Mm,
what I mean? Or mythos, or something like that. A lot of times it's not so much mythos in the folk sense of mythos, but her books are decidedly, almost exclusively, analogs for something like what we would call the black experience. You know what I
right.
mean?
Right.
Uh, Coercive, genetic exchange,
Mm,
you know what I mean?
mhm,
Things like that are
yeah.
very, very central. The problematics and the ethics of um, change, evolution. What are the boundaries of a self? What are the boundaries of a collective self? At what point is one black and or not black, where's the line in the sand around that? I used to say,
Yeah.
like, sometimes it's like, when people of African descent were imported into the Americas, they weren't yet black.
Yeah.
There was some point at which, and I don't know if it's a hard line or a hard boundary, but there's some point at which an African woman gave birth to a black child when she
Mm,
herself was not
mm,
black.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's a very complicated to put your finger on that sort of transformation.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a transposition or
Yeah.
something into blackness out of Africanness. And of course, in real socio-political and concrete material terms, there's no hard line between the
Hmm.
two. But we know, I think most people would admit on a certain level that there's something very unique about blackness, such as it is, as it's been constructed or has evolved over the past couple of hundred years. Certainly in the 20th century, uh, these notions of blackness, which, as soon as you travel the continent a bit and start to see African peoples in their native contexts, or even in some other contemporary contexts, you start to realize that blackness, such as you may have understood it prior to that, uh, it's just not like it's not universal,
Yeah.
like most things, I guess.
Yeah.
Truth be told, at the end of the world, you
Yeah.
say the same thing about whiteness. But so Delaney, IE versus an Octavia Butler was always a really interesting thing to think about. So if you go to cinema to try to address your question maybe a bit, and something like 2001, which I think was less genre defining than genre busting. I mean, it
Mm,
doesn't
mm,
really fit it into, it's come up quite a bit for me recently as I've shared my script with, a bunch of trusted experts. They would
yeah.
laugh at being termed experts. One of the things that's come up several times at least was that you take a long time to get to the story.
Mm,
Like if you don't introduce one of the principal characters to
mm,
the story, damn near somebody said 60 minutes, which is a bit of
mm,
an exaggeration, but you don't introduce them until like, at least a third of the way
yeah.
into the narrative. And I thought about it and I was like, that might be correct on a certain level,
Mm,
but it certainly is not nearly as radical as a 2001: A Space Odyssey, where
mm,
you don't see humans for the first 20 minutes of the film.
mm,
Nobody speaks for the first 20 minutes of the film. And then you're introduced to a completely different set, of characters. At one point, Moonwatcher
yeah.
throws his bone up in the air, and then you just jump to
Yeah.
1,000 years later, and you got humans on the moon.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of back and forth dialogue that feels slightly, it's almost Severance like,
Mm,
save for the fact
mm,
that if you look at the film now, save for the fact that the furniture has a
mhm.
full futuricity about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It could be
100%.
Severance. It
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
Severance.
Yeah.
And I've always said, like in that film, like everybody in that film is like narcotized.
Mm, mm,
So when people do speak, they don't say very much. It's
yeah.
very on the surface the way they talk.
Yeah.
And then you jump from that set of characters, 2 years later, Jupiter.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's no connection. Like the astronauts who are on that mission, they mentioned that I forget the name of the character. He's like a NASA administrator or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
They make reference to him, but there's no real in the classical sort of cinema expectation. The Chekhov notion. If a gun is shown in the
Yeah.
first scene, it's got to be
Yeah.
fired in the last scene.
Yeah.
There's very little of that. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So of course, given the degree to which I have articulated or at least spoken uh, how profound an impact that film had on me, of course, I'm like, of course, my film is going to have some peculiar,
Yeah.
maybe just aspects.
Yeah.
Like I didn't necessarily, there are films that I want to make that are truly, let's say, avant-garde. I would
Mm,
understand them as being far exceeding audiences
mm,
expectations and maybe even tolerances.
Mm,
You know what I mean? But certainly in Cujo, which is the name of my
mm,
film, ostensibly a love story, I'm not trying to do any of that. I mean, this is me trying to tell a story. I don't know if the right word is straightforward, but
mm.
but it is a coherent, linear, I would think, linear narrative. I mean, even though in fact it jumps around, but it's still on the same timeline. It's
Yeah.
jumping around on the timeline. I mean, a lot of these things to me, oftentimes things that I would have framed or understood in my late teens, in my 20s and stuff. At 60 years old now, I look back and I think, I mean, a lot of these formal tropes and stuff, they're not just fatigued
Mm,
or in many ways exhausted. They're
mm,
just a product of the previous century. I mean,
mm,
quite
mm,
literally now.
mm.
They're a product of the previous century, almost the way, you know, in the 70s or 80s, we would have talked about art that people made before 1900,
Right, right, right.
And so at this point, it's just a matter of the inevitable, you know, this too will change, this too will pass, and or things fall apart. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Which is, in a way, inextricably bound up with things coming together as well.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's really
world
interesting.
making and world breaking are inextricably bound up. So, like, even in terms of like the cinema, there's a difference between the cinema I've envisioned for the last 30 years and what I'm making. You know what I
Mm,
mean? And how those
mm.
two things are interact. But I broke in. You were about to say something.
No, not at all. I'm really interested in that part about the generative kind of process of creating form. I had a chance to see your show at 52 Walker last year, and the piece that I haven't been able to get out of my head is the picture unit. And it's
Mm,
this large architectural scale installation in the gallery that takes a lot of the images that we've previously seen you encounter and work with in your films and introduces them in an architectural scale. It makes it something that is no longer just kind of watched on a two-dimensional plane, but is now something that we occupy, we are walking through, it is occupying us kind of as a microcosm of the gallery environment. It creates its own environment. I think
mm,
the reason why I've been so interested in engaging it is because it takes the images themselves aren't changing, but yet it's a completely new work. I'm thinking a lot
mm,
about the Bernie Eames book, Juke Joint, which you reference a lot, which is almost similar in that it's
mm,
photographic, but it's also inviting you in. It's in a certain way the images are kind of constructing something. I'm curious as you kind of talk about this process of creating new forms or creating, like as you talk about in your writing, the transition from the previous form to this kind of new mode of making. As you were thinking about the picture unit, as you think about the writing that you're doing now, when you say in your head, okay, this is the material I'm working with, whether that be image, whether that be narrative, story, and in the process of writing a script, to then making that jump to this kind of new generative, kind of constructed environment that you're interested in. What is that process like for you? Is that making a lot of iterations? Is it kind of making a version and then tweaking it as you go? I'm curious how you negotiate that process.
I mean, both and all. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's funny as you were saying that. I was thinking, just thinking back to Delaney and Octavia Butler. One of the most striking things that Delaney, at least in print, that I know of, to ever said about Octavia Butler, and I mean, a little bit of a critique, I think, but a soft critique. He just said something to the effect. I'm paraphrasing him now that when he reads Octavia Butler's work, sometimes he feels like he's in a eugenics program.
Mm,
And as he was saying what you were saying, I was thinking, my project and my practice has a meta eugenic kind of
mm,
dimension in the sense that, I've sort of said this before as well. Like, at one point, I used to say I'm more interested in aboriginality than originality.
mm, mm,
And another point I've said something more like, I'm sort of interested in things that are less about blackness and more like blackness,
yes.
you know, less about. the Black experience and more like artifacts that seem to have been shaped or formed
Hmm.
by the Black experience, you know. And that's, laughingly a bit of a eugenics thing. You know, I
Mm.
always feel like a big part of my thing is like, if you take A and you take B and you non-consensually force them to crossbreed, what do you end up with? You know,
Mm. Mm.
which is in some ways at least part of the equation or the narrative of Blackness as we
Mm.
understand it. Black people are taken from their uh, natal contexts, forcibly placed, from one petri dish into another petri dish in
Hmm.
another context, in a very volatile context as well, not a stable context. Like to me, Black people who are being introduced into uh, Great Britain or
Hmm.
France or something is just inevitably going to be very different than Black
Mm.
people being introduced into the quote unquote new world
Yeah.
just by the sort of radical difference in the time frame that you're talking about and the stability of the social contexts that Black people being introduced into, whether consensually or non-consensually. You know what I mean? It's just going to be a
Hmm.
different effect. And so in a lot of ways, I think a lot of my practice is an almost obsessive reapplication of uh, some of the kind of generative generative aspects of Blackness as I understand it, or Black being as I understand
Mm.
it. Like I've often said, if you take Black music, which is something obviously I'm very obsessed with,
Hmm.
because it seems, and most people would admit to this, in some ways, the most realized or the sort of apotheosis of Black expressivity. I mean, to the point that, that poets have written about how Black artists in any other mediums always have to get around the music or get
Right.
with the music or have to contend with
Right.
music as this sort of almost unimaginably actualized sort of iteration of Black expressivity. You have to deal with
Yeah.
it. So this music thing is a huge thing to me, but I often find myself thinking, like sometimes I've even said, like, you don't even have to deal with the music. You can just deal with the people who make the music.
Mm.
And so many things become clear and apparent about, the ontological dimensions of Black
Mm.
music. So like I'm very interested in those things in as far as one might apply them to the creation of Black, truly Black, complexly, densely Black expressive modalities other than
Mm.
the big three:
Mm.
music at the top, dance and oratorical stuff. You know
Mm.
what I mean? Like to me, those are the three big things. So, if you look at those things and you like with Black music, it's a simple equation. Traditional African musics, because we wear them or we
Mm.
carry them on our nervous system, find themselves in this new context. Musically, it's a new context. Sociopolitically, it's a new context. Existentially, it's an incredibly dramatic and new and horrifying in many ways context. Sociopolitically, spiritually, all those things. It's a radically new context. And these musics that we carry on our nervous systems, my off-cited quote from Damn June Paik, the music that's going to survive in the future is music you can carry around in your head.
Yeah.
Look at the Middle Passage, such a
Yeah.
profound demonstration of that. Like which cultural modalities not only survive but bloom like
Mm.
exponentially in these new contexts we found ourselves in versus those modalities that didn't bloom or were suppressed or just even died off,
Yeah.
for various reasons. In particular now, obviously, I'm making reference to material expressivity, the traditions of material expressivity, which are very different from dance, oratorical, and music, which are fundamentally immaterial. So you're talking about material expressivity and the complexity of why the things which are fundamental material expressivity change, evolve, or diminish, why they aren't as apparent. And when they are apparent, where are they apparent? You know what I
Mm,
mean? If you look at traditions of material expressivity, art,
mm,
in the Americas, in the US versus Jamaica, in the US versus Haiti, in the US versus Brazil, you know?
mhm,
It's very interesting. I've said this 1,000 years ago now, but back in the early 80s, Cornel West had a conversation with Andrew Stevenson, and he was
mm,
speaking in that profound encyclopedic way about Black culture. And at some
mm,
point, Andrew Stevenson said something like, well, what about visual culture? And he said something like, well, as far as he could tell, it wasn't that apparent.
mm,
And it caused a lot of consternation
mhm,
amongst Black fine
mhm,
artists at the time. In particular, vocal was Howard and Pendell,
mhm,
and then in response to that, in some ways, in response to the blowback from his statement, because people said he was just speaking out of ignorance and he was giving ammunition to those forces that wanted to keep Black people out of this particular medium,
yeah,
participate in this particular medium. He just says, look, I just think the reason why is because all our other forms of expressivity found subsidy and sanctuary in the Black church. And the Black church was
mhm,
the only institution we had. And for, unimaginably predictable reasons, the Black church is a Protestant church, not a Catholic church. And so the Protestant churches obviously have that tendency towards the kind of iconoclasm. You know what I mean? It's
yes,
like they had a problem with graven imagery and things like that. So, I grew up Catholic, say, for example,
mm,
in Mississippi. So, but the first churches I ever attended, of course, were Baptist and Methodist
mm,
churches, because that's by and large what Black people, when you talk about Black Christianity, at least in America, that's by and large you're talking about Protestant.
yeah,
And so, you go into a Black church, there is a profound visuality in that church, but it's not very iconographic.
mm,
You know what I mean?
mm,
Like the
mm,
space, the
mm,
spaces of Black churches, and typically we say architecturally,
mm,
the spaces of Black churches probably have more to do with like something one might term, not so much term, but compared to something like
mm,
Shaker aesthetics. You know what I
right,
mean? It's
right,
fairly
right,
spare. There's very little,
right,
not a ton of ornamentation, very little iconography in it.
mhm,
Versus a Catholic church where
right,
you got sculptures and figures and all this kind of stuff.
right,
You're basically, there's a way in which in the Catholic Church, the iconography is as present, if not more present, than the music.
mm,
The way it permeates the space, the
right,
way the space is occupied. So to me, it was never a coincidence, or certainly never non-significant or signifying, but non-significant, that Jean-Michel Basquiat's parents were on one hand Haitian and or Puerto
mm,
Rican, which
mm,
are both Black Catholic
mhm,
societies. You know what I mean?
right,
If you go to Haiti, the sort of flags and things around voodoo, and you go to Brazil, all the incredible material artifacts that are part of candomblé,
mm,
from the metal, vest they wear to, it's just, if you've ever been to a candomblé ceremony, there's so many material components down to the actual
yeah,
structure of the space. It's very iconographic
mm,
versus the Baptist and Methodist churches, which are somewhat minimalist. You know what I
right,
mean? They feel
right,
minimalist by comparison, which is not so much paradoxical, but something that's very notable is you have these very spare spaces where this
mm,
surplus expressivity is happening.
mm,
As I always say, there are two modalities in Black, and I'm speaking primarily about Black American in this particular instance,
yeah,
like expressive modalities. There's one everybody's familiar with, down to the point that it's like a joke. Like we do
Mm,
extra. We're extra.
mm, mm,
We
mm, mm,
extra.
mm, mm,
Everything we
mm,
do
mm.
is more.
Yeah, yeah,
When you
yeah,
say something jazzy,
yeah,
you mean it's operating above the ground zero of expressivity. It
yeah,
is baroque and
yeah,
dynamic, and it's just extra. It's more than you need
yeah,
to do the job.
yeah.
Julius Erving, Dr. J, Michael
Mm-hmm,
Jordan.
mm-hmm.
It's jazzy.
Right,
It's
right,
more than just putting the ball
right,
in the hole. There's
right,
all this
right,
surplus expressivity that you don't even
right,
necessarily get extra points for.
right,
Not only do you not get extra points
right,
for it, unlike gymnastics where degree of
right,
difficulty impacts how many points you get for it.
right,
Not only do you not get extra points, you get the same amount of points, but
right,
you're raising the level of difficulty.
right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like, why do we persist in that? What is that
Mm,
about? So in the churches, it's somewhat notable that you have these incredibly spare spaces where that
mm.
black, expressive excess is on display,
Right,
highly on display.
right.
But even in those spaces, you still see this other pole of black expressive modality. Like I said, if one is speaking in tongues and that's all that doing more, then the other pole is like holding your tongue.
Mm,
And there's a real tradition of, I was talking to Charles Gaines a few days
mm,
ago. He has this incredible book, and his thesis, I call it
mm,
Charles's thesis,
mm,
about the theater of refusal. Like
mm,
so much that Black artists have done in this context that's powerful and significant has less to do with what you're doing than what you refuse to do.
mm.
Like an unwillingness to enact the predicates and the sort of prerequisites of participation that are imposed on us
Mm,
by the larger dominant
mm.
society, the refusal, because
Yes.
of the theater refusal.
Yes.
So it's much harder. I was saying this to Charles. I was saying, look, the thing is, it's so much harder to talk about things you don't do than things
Right.
that you do. Because when
Right.
you do something, that something is in front of you. But when
Right.
you refuse to do something, you're talking about an absence of something,
Right.
right? So that polarity, that other modality, that like I said, the holding your tongue, the minimalist
Mm,
modality, the not speaking, the not doing,
mm.
it's much harder to grasp. So
Yeah.
for myself at the same time, my early days in particular at my grandmother's church
Mm,
were classically the Black church experience with a lot of singing, a lot
mm,
of, expressive singing would seemingly be in excess of what was required to communicate what was being communicated.
mm,
Um, all this almost extra, I don't want to say, well, certainly extra literate expressivity, if not extra semiotic expressivity. It's operating in these other higher registers of communication. But at the same time, inside of that, you had these other modalities, things like the female ushers in the Black church who didn't
mm,
speak,
mm.
who wore all white in white gloves. And I've jokingly said in the past, I thought they were nurses when I was a kid. I was
Mm,
trying to figure
mm,
out,
mm.
but they never stopped anybody from falling out. you
Yeah.
know. And in a way, they function as a kind of mobile frame because when people would be touched by the spirit or have these excessive displays of feeling,
Yeah.
those ushers would attend to them,
Mm,
but they would never suppress them. They would never
mm,
stop them. They
mm.
would sort of like stand next to them, like on The Price is Right or something, and
Yeah.
go, "Behold,
Yeah. Yeah. You might get a fan.
Yeah,
Something like
exactly,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. We're gonna cool you down so you
Yeah.
can keep doing what you're
Yeah.
doing."
Yeah.
But it wasn't to cool you down so you would stop functioning in that
Right.
register. It
Right.
was like, we don't want you to overheat. Or
Mm,
look at the heat. Check
mm,
out the heat that's on
mm,
display here.
mm,
We're gonna fan them. It's like
mm.
in the Nigerian weddings and stuff, when people are performing and they put the money on them, or in the
Right.
strip joint when
Right.
they put the money on them. That
Right.
fanning
Right.
as a gesture is similar to
Right.
putting the money on them. It's like recognizing they bring in the heat, they
Right.
bring in the energy, they
Right.
bring in they bring in the expressivity. So I've been always fascinated by those two polarities and
Yeah.
how they interact, how they, so you got to Charlie Parker. Well, I would start it off with Coleman Hawkins. You got,
Mhm.
like it's funny in a weird kind of way. If you go back to the first recorded instrumentals, we would say that define jazz, the
Mhm.
jazz voice.
Yeah.
You're gonna go back to Louis Armstrong,
Yeah.
and it's a trumpet. Prior to him was Buddy Bolden, who they say maybe even played a bugle more than a trumpet,
Mm.
but it was never recorded.
Mm.
So we can only imagine what
Yeah.
Buddy Bolden sounded like. But then you go to Louis Armstrong, it is in some ways the beginnings, not the origins of, but the beginnings of what we recognize as the Black virtuosic
Yes.
voice, right? The
Yes.
single solo Black virtuosic voice. And then very quickly, the trumpet is displaced as the dominant solo voice in jazz. That becomes a
Mhm.
saxophone very early on,
Mhm.
right? Aldo Sax invented it in the
Mhm.
1800s. He
Yeah.
invented that instrument. He was not thinking about Black folks.
Not in the slightest.
He was
Yeah.
thinking about marching bands and an instrument that could make sense in the context of marching bands. It's an instrument that to this day is somewhat ill-fitting. Its place in the classical orchestra
Mm.
hierarchy is somewhat ill-fitting because
Mhm.
of his origins. But let's say, you know, that's Coleman Hawkins is the
Mhm.
defining progenitor of that, the saxophone as the single, and I think to this day, obviously, the single dominant signifying instrument in jazz as we
Yeah.
understand it. And you go very quickly from Coleman Hawkins to people like, the John Coltrane's, the Charlie Parkers. Even though Charlie Parker played an alto, it's still that virtuoso speaking in tongues. It
Yeah.
is the speaking in tongues modality. But what you start to see at the same time is a sort of counter response to the dominance of that, of which Miles Davis is both the apotheosis of and the sort of inheritor of.
Yeah.
I would place it, and I've always said is the Holy Trinity to me in jazz, or the part of jazz that I'm most invested in is Billie Holiday, Lester Young, and then Miles Davis. It's sort
Mm.
of the offspring of a somewhat minimalist, relatively speaking, minimalist, less is more approach to
Mm.
Black expressivity in the
Mm.
music.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins played 10 notes, Lester
Yeah.
Young played two.
Yeah.
And then even Lester Young's, when you read about Lester Young's personal style, like the way he walked into a space. They said he would have his horn in a bag with a string and he'd walk in
Mm.
dragging the horn on the floor
Mm.
behind him in the
Mm.
bag. You know what I mean? It's
Mm.
just amazing. Like
Yeah.
on the sort of
Yeah.
postural semantics of it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
fucking incredible. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And people even say it's a shame that Lester Young wasn't recorded. They aren't. I don't know if there aren't any, but there's certainly very few recordings of Lester Young speaking because people have
Mm.
said one of the things that was phenomenal about Lester Young is his speech,
Mm.
which apparently was suffused with so much profanity,
Mm.
but in that same spare style. I mean, I always imagine what did Lester Young speaking
Mm.
talk sound like, but
Mm.
all these things are inextricably bound up with what I say about Black artists oftentimes. And some of this is a consequence of the slave ship that we're all
Yeah.
on, the sort
Yeah.
of space of lack, the
Yes.
space of, I can't find the word I want right now, but
Yeah.
the space of having less than what you need.
Yeah.
Uh, that, Black artists end up being embodied schools of thought.
Mm.
So if you say
Yeah.
Coltrane-esque,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, whereas you said Miles Davis, like, you know what we
Yeah.
mean. If you say Billie Holiday, like, we kind of know what you
Yeah.
mean, as opposed to the Sarah Vaughan's and the Ella Fitzgeralds and the Diana Washingtons, the great, 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 incredible vocalists, but who all, in a way, would be more demonstrators of our ability to have expressive surplus than a
Yes.
Billie Holiday's thing, where her voice, such as it is very thin.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like in
Yeah.
some ways you would say she was more stylist
Yeah.
than a vocalist,
Yeah.
you know? And I would argue like one of the greatest recordings, it's my favorite, honestly, is Lady in Satin, which is her
Mm,
next to last record when her
mm,
instrument, such as it is completely gone. Her voice is
mm,
gone from
mm,
years of,
mm,
various, excesses or,
mm.
drug abuse,
Yeah.
drinking and smoking, shit like that. Her instrument is gone, but
Yeah.
it doesn't affect the power what she's doing at
Uh,
all because
yeah.
so much of her power was never like Whitney Houston. It wasn't based
Right.
on vocal
Right.
chops.
Right.
It was based on a very spare, almost haiku understanding of what you do and how less can be more in
Yeah.
expressive terms. So you got that triumphant of Lester Young, Billie Holiday. Don't explain. That's a refusal.
Hmm.
That's a
Yes.
refusal. That's
Yes.
a refusal. Don't explain. That's a refusal.
Yeah.
Miles, in a silent way,
Yes.
kind of blue. You
Yes.
know what I mean? It's
Yes.
so much about refusals. It's
Yes.
so much about refusals. And so and as far as to go back, way back
Yeah.
to where you started with the picture units, which is,
Yeah.
it excites me even to hear you start off the picture
Yeah.
units. Yeah, of course. I think the picture units for me personally incredible breakthrough, and it's been very fascinating the resistance to it.
Ah.
Even from my supporters, many of my
Ah.
supporters
Yeah.
are people who I would say are, my fundamental support in
Yeah.
this context. There's been a bit of resistance to it, and on a certain level, I would say it's very obviously I'm interested in sequencing images, and this
Yes.
is like the books that
Yes.
preceded them, and like the films or
Yeah.
videos that have preceded them.
Yeah.
It's another way to sequence images, to
Yeah.
actually manipulate or orchestrate how people go from one image to another image. You are
Yeah.
literally physically moving through
Right.
a sequence of
Right.
images and how that's different or the
Right.
same as flipping through a book or
Right.
sitting through a time-based
Right.
video. How is it the same and how is it different? And
Right.
so for me, it's also contending with how I have situated or am constantly attempting to situate myself in contemporary art practice in a way that
Mm-hmm.
is both informed, knowledgeable about everything that's been done before,
Mm.
but at the same time, always attempting and reaching for uh, new forms, new modalities, Cecil Taylor's term, new intensities, is
Mm.
something I heard him say, new
Yeah.
intensities,
Yeah.
seeking those new intensities that are inextricably bound up with what I would term black being.
Mm.
So you both want to be totally versed in everything that's has and is being operative or operatively happening in the actual context, what's at play,
Yeah.
but you also want to introduce your own existentially, sociopolitically, and other kinds of things that are bound up with the Black experience, so-called Black experience. How those things look in this
Yeah.
context. So the picture unit to me is both a continuation of my own. As my dad said, I was doing that from the point I was a
Yeah.
kid. The two earliest things I can remember doing expressively,
Yeah.
that were self-generated in a way would be like, on one hand, Lego blocks,
Yeah.
a Lincoln Logs, even when
Yeah.
I was a
Yeah.
kid,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
sitting there
Yeah.
with these modular things, assembling them in different ways and doing something somewhat similar to, I mean, one is form and the other
Yes.
one is content, like
Yes.
moving pictures around, cutting
Yes.
pictures
Yeah.
out of things and arranging them in books. I
Yes.
did that from my earliest days. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's funny if you would say, what are the earliest instances of me that I can remember of me being expressive, it'd be what? It'd be those two things. Those two things were internal. Like I don't know where
Mm.
they came from. No, in fact, my great grandfather, my grandfather, my aunts, uncles, they were all bricklayers.
Mm.
They did construction work, and but bricklaying was an art. There was an
Mm.
art. There was a craft. There was a high art.
Yes.
The crafts.
Yes.
It wasn't just like a physical craft. It
Right.
was. So I grew up with them laying bricks, and I didn't lay any bricks because I never got to that point.
Yeah.
Maybe like a handful, but
Sure. Sure.
basically I was toting cement.
Yeah.
and bricks to the thing, and then just the art of how you use a trowel
Yeah.
and how you use bricks. And it's funny, I would say the substance, the concrete
Yeah.
between the bricks, laying a brick.
Yes.
I've also always joked with my friend Theasta. Damn, Theasta, you knocked out a whole realm of thing that I would have done, I would have
Yeah.
run with. But
Yes.
Theasta is just,
Yes.
he's on that space, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? But yeah, the bricklaying thing. So I grew up around that. So, but the thing is that, what one is always searching for are ways to authentically enter into these spaces that have very real aesthetic and historical parameters. But how
Mm.
do you authentically, and I would say less, maybe even less authentically and powerfully enter into these spaces? How do you bring the heat? Like I was saying, how do you
Yes.
bring the heat? And so the picture unit to me is just part and parcel of trying to do things that both you can understand in relationship to things that preceded them in the context of art. Everything from, architecture itself, which is sort of, is in proximity to art. So to
Yes.
me, and it's the same minimalist thing again, Mies and Miles. I used
Yes.
to say Mies and
Yes.
Miles,
Yes.
the Barcelona Pavilion.
Yes.
That's a very similar aesthetic uh, modality. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Understanding philosophy. It's a
Yeah.
very similar aesthetic philosophy. Um, so you got that on one hand, you got the Mies thing, you got the Dan Graham thing, his
Right.
pavilions.
Right.
You know, I
Yeah.
always understand the picture units as mazes,
Mm-hmm.
linear mazes.
Yes.
One of my favorite comments, somebody was saying, like, you walk into this fucking thing, you see this horrible image, and you just want to put your head down and move on to the next
Mm.
thing. He
Mm.
said, but shockingly, it's just more of it.
Right.
Now, I
Right.
love that idea. I've only done them with 3 rooms so far.
Uh-huh.
And in a couple of instances, I've had to reduce it to 2 rooms.
Mm.
But I really want to do one with 10 rooms. I want
Mm.
to do one that when you start, you get to a point of dead reckoning where you
Mm.
don't know whether to go forward or to go back.
Uh,
You know what I mean? Even though it's a
yeah.
line, it's still a maze. It's
Yeah.
still a maze. And it's been very interesting, the resistance to me rolling that out as a fundamental part of my exhibition practice. Like, as far as
Uh-huh.
I was concerned, I would never do another show without a picture unit.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
didn't have to. My show at the or my work at least at the rotunda at the
Yeah.
the divorce
Mm-hmm.
in Paris, the Pinot connection. One of the big points of contention from the beginning was that I wanted, as opposed to how it was presented, love is the message, solo monolithic
Yeah.
presentation in the center of the space, which
Yeah.
I can't deny that people seem to have experienced it very powerfully.
Yeah.
So this is one of those instances. I feel a little bit like Kanye, like
Yeah.
I think the way I want to present it
Yeah.
would have been as powerful, if not more powerful,
Yeah.
but we'll never
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
never know
Yeah.
because we
Yeah. Yeah.
never got a
Yeah.
chance to. But I want to have 3 screens and a
Mm.
picture unit in the center of the rotunda.
Mm. Mm.
So you're going to be able to enter into this open space and then have
Mm.
this kind of private experience in the middle
Yeah.
of the space surrounded by these monitors.
Yeah.
That's how I would want it to present it. And that's
Interesting.
more consistent with, like I've been like pushing on this for several years now. It's like the monolithic presentation is like I'm just not interested in it. You can create that in at least 2 different ways. One, you can put
Right.
one big thing,
Right.
one solo thing, or you can do a Greco-Roman sculpture garden where
Right.
everything just by fact that this sort of the accidental whiteness
Yeah.
agree. You create this monolithic effect, even though the figures might be doing different things. They're all
Right.
white and they're all of a certain
Right.
proportion. There's not going to be one that's like 20 feet high and one that's 10 feet high. You just don't see that. They
Right.
tend to be all about the same height,
Right.
about the same amount of mass and things like that. And I was like, I don't want to do either of those things. I want to do
Mm.
something that is to me fundamentally more jazz-like.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
polyvalent.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things happening in a lot of different registers, and those registers are made to, if not reconcile, at least made to play with one another in a certain
Mm,
kind of way. So 52 Walk, more than anything, above and beyond the pitching unit, was an attempt to do that. Versus what I ended up with at Gladstone, which I'm very proud of,
yeah,
which is a single monolithic solo presentation of
yeah,
my big Gazzara film, my
yeah,
Taxi Driver project.
yes,
You go
yes,
in,
yes,
there's one screen.
yes,
In that space, as I was advised by my, dearly departed, Barbara Gladstone, that space just lends itself to that. And so it was
yes,
a good call for that space. But I really was feeling compelled and drawn to, like, okay, I know I do video, I know I do found footage,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
People try to box you, and I'm
yeah,
just like very determined to not be trapped, even if it's trapped in structures that I myself built. I just
yeah,
want to be trapped by them. So,
yeah,
when they got to a geek, it was like, oh, I'm sick of this found footage thing. So no found footage. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah,
none
yeah,
at all. No
yeah,
footage even at
yeah,
all. It's
yeah,
digitally generated. No footage that had had a previous life or had any kind of concrete or material rendered relationship to the real world.
yeah,
Not represent. It is representational, but you know what I mean.
yes,
I didn't go out and take a picture of the
yes,
universe and
yes,
restructure that, or I didn't go out and appropriate other people doing that
yes,
and then restructure that. And then you come back with being Gazara after that, which is again, I guess in a sense you could say it's found footage, but it's very, very
right,
different from the sort of collaged, sort of practice in things like Love is the Message,
yeah,
Kingdom Come Fast,
yeah,
Dirty Tesla, any number of those things,
yeah.
Apex even. So,
Yeah, it makes sense. I think one thing that I'm really curious your thoughts on, kind of on that idea about the ways in which the work becomes kind of formal or kind of physical, is that also showed at 52 Walker, which is the large array series, where there are these cutouts on metal of figures that we recognize. Um, I'm curious because it seems like there's an impulse for the work to kind of occupy our space. It's kind of being almost, I don't want to say disarmed from the photograph or from the mediation that we're comfortable with from the photograph, but
mhm,
the photograph figures are now looking at us. It's like they've kind of transgressed that threshold, and they're kind of stepping into the world. You're also presenting these photographs that have painting on them with this like kind of thick, almost impasto on top of them. Like there's this breaking down of the photographic medium in a certain way to kind of
mhm,
make it physical, almost like oozing, dripping, something with a really dense materiality. At the same time,
mhm,
you're also presenting a lot of these new rail pieces with these large, kind of thick metallic rails that have been fixed together. I'm curious where this interest in this very physical, tactile materiality comes from, and I think as you see it, how it's informing working through, just as you described, this kind of fundamentally black, but also not necessarily informed by like topics of blackness, but more the experience of black making, like you say, creating work as black people create. My favorite quote of yours is, "No one ever asks Michael Jordan, why are you dunking the basketball in that moment? It just is occurring." I think that's so brilliant. So I'm curious
mhm,
how this kind of, I don't want to call it a turn because I think it's something you've been doing for a really long time, but
mhm.
the showcasing of deeply physical objects, what that means for your work now.
Well, it's funny. When you first started speaking, I was thinking one thing that jumped in my head is I think one of the most beautiful quotes or insights from John Michel. It almost sounds like something he would have said if he had lived longer.
Mm,
It's not something I associate with a
mm,
guy in his early 20s. So, and I'm not sure exactly when he said it, but he said music is how we decorate time, art is how we decorate space.
hmm.
It's like, very deep, but
Yeah,
or insightful, let's
yeah,
say. One of the things that I've thought, and I've talked to about it recently, if you look at John Michel's work, which I've looked at very closely,
yeah,
in many ways, I've very actively followed, maybe parallel the arc of his development at a distance because that's just how I am. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I'm definitely one to like I'm gonna watch you stick your
Mm,
toe in that pool before I'm gonna stick
mm,
my toe in the pool.
mm, mm,
I was never interested in being Captain Kirk. I was always
mm,
interested in being Mr. Spock, you know.
mm,
Just like I was never interested in being Charlie Parker or Jimi
mm,
Hendrix, like John
mm,
Michelle said, I want to
mm,
be the Jimi Hendrix of the art world.
mm.
I love Jimi Hendrix, but I would never make a
Yeah,
pronouncement like that. He
yeah.
died at 27,
Mm,
as did John Michelle. So I've always been interested in long distance runners, you know.
mm,
I was never a sprinter.
mm,
People, I think, and this is like just on my personal thing, think could get confused because, you know, I shot daughters in the dust. I was like
mhm,
27, 28,
mhm,
you know. And the things that I've, you know, shot Crooklyn, worked on my,
mhm.
you know, things that I've done that look very much like, oh, he's doing his thing
Yeah,
very early,
yeah,
or, you know, a prodigy kind of thing, which
yeah,
most people always experience that. You know, anybody who's creative,
yeah,
most times when people are creative, somebody identified very early on that they had
yeah, yeah.
something going on. We've
Yeah.
all experienced it. Um, but one of the things that to me, like in this paralleling or tracking of John Michel's development that I've said is that in many ways his work was diagrammatic from the
Mm,
beginning.
mm,
There were diagrams.
mm.
I mean, back to, you know, the text that everybody was going back to Gray's Anatomy. The
Yeah.
diagrams.
Yes. Yes.
You know, the diagrams.
Yes.
Warhol said about John Michel in his diaries, how long could John Michel make paintings of screaming Negroes?
Right.
Apparently to the end,
Right.
but they are diagrams. I
Yeah.
remember like shortly before he died, like the last 6 months before John Michel passed, he had I saw a post in Flash Art for a show that was coming up in Italy
Mm,
that he had painted, and it had this image of John Brown with a hammer,
mm,
and he had painted it in,
mm,
meaning I like to say he put flesh on those bones.
mm,
If those diagrams were skeletal,
mm.
like as I think they almost inevitably already are
Yeah.
skeletal,
Yeah.
he had put flesh on the bones. He had painted
Mm,
it in a
mm,
way that I
mm,
associate with, you know, old master paintings or with
mm,
European painting. You know, European painting is not diagrammatic
mm.
by and large. You know, from early when you see Cimabue and things like this, very on pre-Renaissance
Yeah.
painters, you know, there's flesh on those bones, so to
Mm,
speak. And so to me, what was one of the things that's very, very interesting about his trajectory was what I would term the move from the diagrammatic to the suggestion
mm.
that he was about to start filling those diagrams in.
Yeah.
Um, John Michel was in this way, he was similar to Michael Jackson.
Mm,
I saw something recently from Michael Jackson's vocal coach. He
mm,
was saying Michael had 4 octaves.
mm,
The octave that we were familiar with, the high, he said, but basically, you know, he sang in that tenor.
mm,
But there are 2 down to the bass
mm,
profundo he could do. He
mm.
could do that Teddy Pendergrass voice,
Yeah.
and he could go lower
Yeah.
than that.
Yeah.
And he said, sometimes he said Michael would call him on the phone, and he would answer in his normal voice.
Mm,
Hello,
mm,
Michael, why don't you use that voice? Why don't you use
mm,
very beautiful register? Why
mm,
don't you use the music? I don't want to say, I don't want that register. I want to
mm,
keep it in this register.
mm.
In my interviews, I'm going to talk like this,
Huh.
and I'm going to sing in this register.
Huh.
And his singer said, because he was very concerned with being childlike in his
Yes. Yeah.
expressivity. Now, that's so similar to John Michel's move. It's a
Mm,
strategic move
mm,
as much as anything, as much as an aesthetic move, it's a strategic move. Because, and I've said this before, Michael Jackson was a shapeshifter.
Hmm.
And one of the things that was a consequence of him speaking in a high voice like this and singing his voices, people took him to be a boy.
Hmm.
And he knew the beauty as a black man of being underestimated and being
Hmm.
thought to be a boy
Hmm.
because he was a child star. He got
Hmm.
it. There were
Hmm.
some very real reasons why he wanted to stay in that familiar register, and he could see the benefits.
Yeah.
Paul McCartney would have never shared with him,
Yeah.
hey, you know, the Beatles catalog is for sale.
Right.
He would never shared it
Right.
if it was
Right.
Teddy Pendergrass talking
Right.
to him
Right.
because it would have been a potential threat.
Right.
But Michael's singing that register is
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And the thing about John Michelle, like I think his childlike drawing was a register. It
Mm.
was a register.
Mm.
It had the same effect. Like
Mm.
people didn't take him seriously in a certain kind of way, but he also gained certain kinds of opportunities
Mm.
in a certain kind of way. It
Mm.
wasn't a person in the beginning where it looked like it was trying to operate in the same terms of whatever the standard was in contemporary art, you know?
Yeah.
They were diagrammatic.
Yeah.
And he, you know, like childlike drawings, he
Yeah.
left
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
you know? I just saw this image recently I'd never seen before, and I've looked at so many of his
Mm.
images. It's shocking to find something that you hadn't seen before.
Mm.
And so I have to find out what year. I'm gonna try to find out what year it is.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, man, when you
Yeah.
look at it because it looks like on a certain level, it makes you uncertain it's actually John Michelle's work.
Mm.
But it looks like it's definitely colored in and
Mm.
the flesh is in. And the way he's drawing his hands, they have certain aspects, like the kind of uneven scale that you see that
Yeah.
you associate with kids' drawings.
Yeah.
The arms are too big for the body, stuff
Right.
like that. You
Right.
know, indifference to perspective as we normally might understand it.
Yeah.
Like certain of those things are in this drawing, but other things are completely dispensed with.
Mm.
There's no way you would look at this drawing and think any kid drew
Right.
them. Where some of his best drawings, like my son did drawings when he was in kindergarten
Mm.
that I have to this day.
Mm.
And I would say they're proto Basquiat's or
Mm.
Basquiat's.
Mm.
They
Mm.
look like Basquiat's. The
Mm.
line in them
Mm.
has a quality that John Michelle
Yeah.
mastered.
Yeah.
But this particular drawing doesn't have any of that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to look at. And
Yeah.
it reminds me very much of that image of John Brown that I saw in that poster. And it gives you a sense of what kinds of spaces that John Michelle perhaps would have inevitably explored. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
Now, I mentioned that in relationship to you were saying you asked a question or made an observation about the development of my thing
Mm-hmm.
from where I started off to where I am now.
Yeah.
I would suggest that my early things are diagrammatic in a very similar way. Not out of any attempt to be childlike or
Sure.
to go beneath the register, the
Sure.
radar or anything, but because, you know, it's one of the reasons that Black material expressivity is relatively speaking underdeveloped
Yeah.
versus immaterial expressivity is
Yeah.
because you got to have access to material.
Yeah.
So I worked with what I had, you
Yeah.
know, or what I
Yeah.
had access to.
Yes.
And these were things that just were on the internet,
Yeah.
basically. You know, I sequenced those things.
Yeah.
Very much, you know, you don't have to search really hard. The history of hip hop and
Yeah.
sampling and all that kind of stuff, or assemblage, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the spaces that you see material expressivity in Black America is in the South.
Yeah.
Black people have a completely different relationship to space and material
Yes.
in the South
Yeah.
than they do
Yeah.
in the North.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody grew up, if you grew up in the South, with those neighbors who had what we call yard sculptures.
Mm.
They would just have these crazy junkyard
Yeah.
assemblages. They
Yeah.
weren't just like trash.
Yeah.
They'd be like worked and assembled and even sometimes literally welded together.
Yeah.
You would just see that. It wasn't
Yeah.
anything. And it always had a vaguely kind of, not so much anti-Christian, but being out to pagan. It had a pagan
Right.
dimension.
Right.
So maybe not so much heretical, but it had a pagan dimension. You know,
Right.
you felt like this person was operating outside of the bounds of the normally accepted practices regarding
Yeah.
material expressivity. Um, so like for me, this whole move from my early, which was preceded by years of books with pictures and assembling things, this
Yeah.
move from the found footage films to this other thing is just a natural progression of like the
Yeah.
move from, it's like Louis Kahn,
Yeah. Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
drawing, you're doing drafting
Yeah.
until you're 70.
Yeah.
I mean, if you one of the reasons I dropped out of or abandoned architecture from the beginning, I just wasn't prepared to spend 30 years
Yeah.
drawing other people's work.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
wasn't. And the
Yeah.
kinds of things that I was interested in doing, it just seemed that Black people didn't have the material means to support a practice
Right.
that was interested in the same questions I'm now interested in.
Right.
If kind of blue was a house, what does it
Right.
look like?
Right. Yeah.
Majority of Black people don't own their homes.
Right.
Of course, many Black people do own their
Yeah.
homes, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Home ownership is a thing.
Yeah.
Just getting a home is a thing.
Yeah.
Very few people could afford to subsidize a Black architect experimenting
Right.
a
Right.
Philip Johnson glass house,
Right. Right.
Falling Water,
Yeah. Yeah.
Farnsworth House.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
our material means aren't enough
Yeah.
on an individual basis to subsidize a Black. It didn't seem like that at the time.
Yeah.
So this whole idea of access to material is just crucial. You
Yeah.
work with what you have to work with.
Yeah.
So I started off doing that, but as I have outlived John Michelle,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I've just had, and as I came to my mature practice radically later than his,
Mm-hmm.
he is the poster child for doing it straight out the womb, damn
Yeah.
near. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Operating at a
Yeah.
certain level.
Yeah.
I did things, they were fragments, and in a sense, less diagrams than just fragments, like I
Yeah.
said. Did I think, had I had the wherewithal or support, I'm not sure what that would have looked like, because
Yeah.
a lot of it is defined by certain, I can only term mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
struggles around with mental illness and stuff, ADHD, whatever you want to call it now. So early struggles around that stuff made it difficult for me to actualize certain
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, part of the difficulty with actualizing certain things were fundamentally bound up with a certain lack of support as
Mm.
well
Yeah.
around actualizing those things. I mean, unlike John Michelle, who did some scribbles, like literally
Yeah.
scribbles on the wall,
Yeah.
and that was evidence enough for people to, Anina No Say or whatever, kicking, hey,
Yeah.
right, have my
Yeah.
basement. I'm gonna make this canvas. Just do what you want to do.
Right.
I didn't ever really. I had incredible support from mentors and people like that, but like Black people with respect to architecture, they just didn't have certain kinds of means to subsidize things I was interested in, which are only coming to fruition now.
Yeah.
So there were any number of things, like Greg always said, like early on,
Yeah.
I did the Super 8 film, shot it on film, on video, called Considerations,
Mm.
which for years, up until the last 10 years, I would have always said my practice as a filmmaker, my practice went backwards, my career went forward.
Mm.
So like, it might seem strange to say that, and I would say the first sort of generally like scene or that I did that people are familiar with would be like my cinematography work on Daughters
Sure.
of Dust, right?
Yeah.
That's the point at which I kind of entered the public discourse
Yeah.
around, Black expressivity and stuff.
Yeah.
But for the, certainly for Greg and my closest associates, like that was an interesting moment because on one hand, people who had previously written me off as just being, like you playing the saxophone with oh, you know, you
Right,
just
right, right,
it
right, right.
just that motherfucker can't play.
Yeah,
And like for a lot of people, it was like, wow, he can actually play the changes.
yeah, yeah.
But in a sense, like I said, my career went forward, but my practice went backwards
Mhm.
because considerations had such it was the first time I'd ever done anything. Like I'm 21, maybe. First time I ever done anything where I felt like this is me. Like
Yeah,
you actually can see me.
yeah,
This is me doing my thing. I still stand behind it, but I
yeah,
didn't quite know what to do with it.
yeah,
It wasn't anything. If I looked at my peers at the time, we'd all sit around talk about what we want to do.
yeah,
While I had Hollywood dreams, it's like
yeah,
they would look at my thing and go like, dude,
yeah, yeah,
there
yeah,
is no
yeah,
fucking chance
yeah,
in hell.
yeah,
It's like you might as well be, taking a snowball to hell and trying to
yeah,
sell
yeah,
that shit. You
yeah.
know what I mean? It just didn't fit. And they seemed to a certain degree, some of them at least, shocked when they saw daughters. Like, we didn't know you had it
Mm,
in you. So
yeah.
then I went down this trajectory where I was trying to figure out how to insinuate, like I had done in daughters to a certain degree, insinuate my sort of surplus expressivity, like the dunks and
Mm,
stuff,
mm,
into the game of filmmaking. Like,
mm,
how could I bring those things to bear? How could I bring these new intensities? And there were intensities that oftentimes, more often than not, the directors,
yeah,
they didn't understand, or they were just like, I just want a good image.
yeah,
I want an image that's in focus. And I was
yeah,
like, well, yeah, I could do that. I'm going to do that. But there's all these other things. It can be
yeah,
in focus and be good and still be
yeah,
doing all these other things as
yeah.
well. You know, Michael Jackson's voice doesn't preclude Michael Jackson from dancing. They're
Right,
not either or
right,
propositions,
right,
or playing a guitar, whatever else he
right.
would have made it could have wanted to do.
Yeah.
They don't preclude that. So my trajectory was one in which I wouldn't call it a dabble because I was obsessively interested in certain things and continued to touch base with them, even as I was trying to, and increasingly despondent over an inability to figure out how to bring those things to bear successfully, bring those things to bear in my practice. So I just
Yeah.
felt like I gained some skills, some like professional skills or something, but I just seemed to move further and further away from my vision of
Mm,
what cinema could be, to the point that
mm,
by the time I hit my late 30s, I just as actively was saying things like, I'm retired from filmmaking. I'm not shooting
mm,
anymore.
mm,
I'm just going to try to do this art thing,
mm.
you know? And it was very interesting to see how quickly it was like I said it aloud and it happened. It's like I said it out loud. Within six
Uh,
months, I was in the Whitney Biennial,
uh,
you know?
yeah,
But
yeah,
within 2 years, I had become incredibly disenchanted with even that. It's
yeah,
like the art world in 2000 was incredibly segregated.
yes,
I got tired of going to parties,
yeah,
being the only blackface there. I
yeah,
got tired of the kind of inadvertent pressure that's put on you when you enter into a space as only one of a certain kind of other,
yeah,
and you have to play off that alienation. You have to
yes,
make it like it don't exist, or it's
yeah,
not fucking weird or whatever.
yeah,
And to articulate the weirdness of it is to foreground your alienation in a way that makes everybody around you uncomfortable.
yes,
So you're just forced to just stomach it.
yeah,
And at a certain point I just couldn't manage it anymore.
yeah,
So I just walked away from the art world,
yeah,
which takes me back to like Love is a Message, which, as I said, I wasn't thinking about the art world. I had
yeah,
long since abandoned the art world 10
yeah,
years before. Like, I'm turning 50, around turning 50, you know, 2002, 2003, I stopped or just ceased to attempt to operate in the art context. I wasn't
yeah,
thinking about it. I had said, well, film just makes more sense. So,
yeah,
and so
yeah,
I kind of, I found myself in this situation. I'd done a documentary, Dreams of Colder Than Death,
yeah,
which was you know, was offered to me and I took it and ran with it like, you know, a
Mm.
desperate man who was looking for what was next.
Yeah.
You know, I've said this before too. Being 50 and not knowing what you're doing is frightening.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why I had landed, why I had landed. It just
Yeah.
seemed like all this sort of potential had by and large not manifested in any
Mm.
substantial kind of way. And you know, I did Dreams of Cold and Death. Somebody approached me about doing a commercial as a result of that,
Mm.
as much as anything. That went south really fast.
Mm.
I got paid. I was in New York. I sat down. It was the very beginnings of citizen recorded video of, you know, police
Yeah.
brutality and things like that.
Yeah.
I had just been throwing these things into a file just so I had them.
Yeah.
Because they would often disappear very quickly. You'd see
Right.
things and they'd disappear. And I just sat down and I just looked at all the footage I had, and I just, people say, "Oh, you edited it." I didn't,
Yeah.
not in the classic sense of
Yeah.
editing. It's more like I assembled it.
Yeah.
I just put one thing after the next
Yeah.
and looked at it and said, "Wow, this thing
Yeah.
is crazy."
Yeah.
And then I moved a few things around.
Yeah.
But within 2 hours, 90% of Love is a Message was done.
Yeah.
Like, you know, pretty much, I mean, I certainly added a handful of things
Yeah.
after that moment. But so I don't know, man. Like, so to me, I came to almost the exact opposite of John Michelle. I've
Yeah.
not only come through my practice in my own evolution so much later when
Yeah.
I'm older and I've seen a lot.
Yeah.
Like, I have the benefit of having seen John Michel's trajectory, David Hammond's
Yeah.
trajectory. I met David when I was 19.
Yeah.
I've seen those trajectories. And I had actually entered the art world at one point and then jumped back out. Like I said, I was always
Mhm.
very,
Yeah.
and then I guess, you know, this is like, I can't rationalize it as anything but like just ancestor spirit directed, you know.
Yeah.
Next thing I knew, I got Love is a Message. I'm sitting there looking at it like something I didn't even create on a certain
Yeah.
level. And the most I could imagine for is to show it on YouTube. That's what
Yeah.
I was,
Yeah.
that was the end of my ambition for it, that it would
Yeah.
show on YouTube. And my friends, close friends, all said, do not put it on YouTube. And they were all
Mm.
urging me because there was a
Mm.
real pressure, because I wanted to share it with people, real pressure to share it, to
Yeah.
let it loose in the world. And fortunately for me, a very close friend, Khalil Joseph, I've
Yeah.
told this story before, took it
Mm.
to Art Basel.
Mm.
Gavin Brown, my dealer, saw
Mm.
it, tracked me down.
Mm.
Wow. I mean,
Mm.
you interested in this? Yeah.
Mm.
I want to show it in my gallery. What?
Mm.
You know, like, oh, part of a group show next year?
Huh.
No, 2 weeks from now,
Huh.
by itself. I'm like, what?
Huh.
I couldn't get my head wrapped around it, but you know, here my friend Greg also intervened and just said, get out of your own way, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just what difference does it make? Let them
Yeah.
show it. Like,
Yeah.
you know, you can always put it on YouTube
Yeah.
afterwards, you know?
Yeah.
And here I am now. I find myself
Yeah.
here now. So